I love building Noah's Arks and could be happy cutting out animals all day long. This project is for a large ark, approximately 16 inches long, 7 inches wide, and 12 inches high. The animals enter through sliding doors on either side of the ark. This set will make a great child's room decoration or a toy for an older child. It would also make a fine prop to use in a Sunday school class to tell the story of Noah and the animals. Gluing the ark's parts together is challenging, but I'll provide some cutting and clamping tips. The plans are downloadable from toymakingplans.com, and I'll leave a link in the description. You may be able to dig into your scrap bin to find the wood you'll need to cut the animals. I made mine from oak, maple, walnut, and sapele. I can't wait to get started building Noah's friendly animal ark. Sometimes you need to think a bit before starting a project, particularly before you do any cutting. Maybe the old phrase should be modified from measure twice, cut once to think once, measure twice, then cut once. The sides for this ark are a little under 16 inches wide, but I don't have any half-inch stock wide enough to accommodate the pattern's height. After measuring and thinking about it, I realized I didn't need to edge join another board the entire 16-inch length. Only a few inches were required in the middle to cover the tall middle part of the ark. That would save material and result in less waste. I cut two lengths 16 inches long and two shorter lengths to form the glue up in the middle to give me the width I needed there. I needed to joint both edges of the 16-inch boards because one edge would form part of the ark's bottom and the other would be edge joint in the glue up. I didn't need to joint both edges of the shorter boards because one side would be partially cut off later, but I ran both edges through the machine for the few seconds the operation took. I measured to find the middle of the 16-inch wide panel and the middle of the short panel, and then I placed them next to each other and centered the pattern on them. From that placement, I determined the width I would need on the short panel to end up with the size panels I would need to make the ark's sides. It will be easier to trim those to width now than after the glue-up is complete, so I took those pieces over to the table saw to complete that operation. Now I'm ready for the glue-up. I purchased my glue in gallon bottles because it's less expensive that way, and then I refill small containers from the gallon. It's much easier to squeeze out a small bead of glue this way. I applied a bead of glue and used my fingertip to spread it along the length of the shorter board. Then I used the same technique to apply glue to only the middle portion of the long board that would come in contact with the shorter board. I found two perfect length F-clamps on my storage rack and added one to each end of the glue-up area. That will be sufficient, and I see no need to add a third clamp in the center because the length being glued together is only a few inches long. I checked to ensure the two boards were even before tightening the clamps securely. The glued-up panel will probably just fit in my thickness planner, but avoid making that step necessary will be better. I used the shop towel to wipe off the glue squeeze-out. The squeeze-out indicates I have sufficient glue on the joint. No squeeze-out could indicate the joint is glue-starved and the joint could fail. Both sides produced a modest squeeze-out, indicating the joint's integrity. I glued up the second panel in the same manner. While the glue dries, I can move on to the layout for the other parts. I have a long half-inch poplar board in stock that I'll use for most of the rest of the ark's parts. I've made this ark before and knew I would make it multiple times, so I'd made patterns for the large parts just like I did for the side. I cut these patterns from masonite and only need to trace them, avoiding the fuss and mess of adhesive, paper patterns, and tape. The first piece I traced is a shape that will be painted blue to represent water. I traced the shape onto the half-inch poplar and cut it to length with my radial arm saw. I set this piece aside to cut out the irregular shape on the scroll saw later. The following three parts are for the ark's ends and the house structure's middle on top of the ark. I set each pattern down on the board and spaced them apart to leave room to cut them to length later using the radial arm saw. I marked the length that included all three parts with a square, then made that cut with the saw. These pieces must be exactly the same width, so after I cut that piece to length, I took it to the table saw to make the rip cut. The width is critical because these three pieces fit between the ark's sides. Getting the sides glued on properly will be impossible if they aren't the same width. I know this because one time when I built one of these, fitting the sides onto the ark was a nightmare. It's always a good practice to make all rip cuts for the same width pieces simultaneously to prevent problems like this from developing. I finished drawing the pictures onto the board, made the cross cuts at the radial arm saw, and then set the pieces aside to make the scroll saw cuts later. Not counting the ark's sides, the largest part of the set to cut was the piece for the water. It's not complex, but it is rather long, so at times much of the wood is hanging off the front of the scroll saw table. That's not a big problem, but I use a dead man foot switch to start and stop the saw. At the far end of the cut, with most of the workpiece hanging off the table, I had to stretch my left leg and stand on my right leg at an uncomfortable angle for what felt like a long time. I could have temporarily moved the saw's power cord to a wall outlet, but that would have meant moving the saw stand twice. Ultimately, it was less work to stretch for a minute or two. There are some parts made from thicker stock, and I'll move on to setting them up now. The plans show 3 trees made from 3/4 inch thick wood. I'm using poplar because it takes paint well, and I'll paint the leaves green and the trunk brown. This piece of poplar is a little rough, so I'll have to run it through the thickness planer, but first I need to determine what length I need. I quickly traced the tree's outline, traced another next to it, and then traced a third tree. That gave me the length I needed for the 3 trees, so I marked it with a line and made the crosscut at the radial arm saw. The aquatic animals at the set are made from 1/2, 3/4, and 1.5 inch thick material, and I'll be using poplar for all of them because they'll be painted gray. The whales are the largest, obviously, and they'll be cut from 1.5 inch poplar. While I had masonite patterns for the large arc parts and for the tree, because it's such a simple shape, all the animals are cut from paper patterns. I set a whale pattern on the edge of a long 6/4 poplar board to determine the length I'd needed to cut for the whales. That piece was wider than I needed, and because it wasn't very long, I used the radial arm saw to rip it to width rather than take the time to set up the rip fence on the table saw for one short cut. The glue is dry. I removed the clamps and did a little light sanding to clean up the tiny amount of glue squeezed out along the joints. You can see why I made a template for this pattern. It took 4 sheets of paper to print, and the sheets needed to be joined to make the full pattern. The plans provided excellent instructions on how to do this, and the masonite pattern is a real time saver because now all I have to do is trace the pattern onto the wood every time I make an arc. I lined up the bottom of the pattern with the bottom edge of the glued up panel, and I slid it over so it was centered on the panel. Then I grabbed a pencil and traced the outer edges, plus the portholes, the windows in the house on the top deck, and the door on the side for the animal's entrance. I repeated the procedure on the second side. The next step will be to drill pilot holes for the inside cuts for the door and windows. I'll use a 1.5 inch diameter Forstner bit to drill the portholes. There are 2 1.5 inch portholes on each side of the ark, and I'll drill them with a Forstner bit. I highly recommend Forstner bits rather than spade or hole saw bits for large diameter holes. Of course, you can drill a pilot hole and cut the portholes with your scroll saw if you don't have any large bits. Years ago, I purchased a boxed set of Forstner bits at a woodworking show in the Chicago suburbs. It has sizes from 1/4 to 2 inches in diameter. Of course, I use the smaller sizes more frequently, but it is handy to have the larger sizes available when needed. I always use a backer board at the drill press, as it dramatically reduces tear out on the backside of the workpiece. Another way to minimize tear out with Forstner bits is to drill until the center point breaks through, flip the piece over, and complete the hole from the backside. After I drilled the 1.5 inch holes, I removed that drill bit, put it back in the storage box, and pulled up my box of smaller bits. I can't remember where or when I purchased this box, but it was a good investment. It has compartments to keep the drill bits separated by size, and there are multiples of the smaller bits because you'll inevitably break those smaller sizes. I found the box invaluable when I have to drill a hole for a slightly off-sized dowel. For example, a 1/4 inch dowel can easily be 1/64 larger or smaller than a 1/4 inch. If you need a tight fit, 1/64 can make a noticeable difference. I used a 1/8 drill bit for the pilot holes for the 2 windows and the door. These openings are large, so drilling a tiny pilot hole barely larger than the saw blade was unnecessary. It's much easier to thread the blade through a 1/8 hole. I'll cut the sides to shape next. This is half-inch poplar, which puts me on the border of choosing between a number 5 and a number 7 blade. Poplar is soft and the curves are gentle on this piece, so a number 5 blade will be sufficient. The number 7 would cut a bit faster, but there was already a number 5 blade in the saw, so I let that be my final determination to choose the size. As I mentioned, there are no complex cuts on this piece. However, because it's long, there will be a time when a large portion of the workpiece will be in front of the blade and hanging off the front of the saw's table. I use a dead man foot switch to turn the saw on and off, and when I come to that part of the cut, I have to stretch my left leg and stand on my right leg at an awkward angle. I'm always happy to complete that part of the cut. Now we'll make the cuts for the windows on the upper deck and the door to the lower deck. These will all be easy cuts. The curves are gentle, the straight lines aren't long, and the corners are arcs rather than sharp 90-degree angles. Notice that the two windows are not the same size. One is longer than the other. I'm not quite sure they were designed this way, but I like the look and won't change it. The access door is square, although the corners are rounded rather than sharp 90-degree angles. One of the unique design features of this arc is that the opening is closed off by two sliding doors. I think this was a very clever design, and I'll show you how it works when I start assembly and add the bottom and top decks. They contain the pieces that hold the doors in place. The doors slide open like an elevator or the turbo lift on the Starship Enterprise, although I admit they don't make that cool swishing sound when they open or close. Before I start any assembly, I'm going to cut the animals. This is the most fun part of the project for me. When I show off the Noah's Arks in my retail store, I usually tell people that I would be happy to sit in my shop all day only cutting animals. There's something relaxing, almost mesmerizing about the process. This is the only ark set I make that contains aquatic animals, and they seem like a good place to start. I'm making the marine animals from poplar, as I will paint them all gray. They will all be displayed on a light blue piece to represent water. The sharks are cut from 3/4 poplar, so I switched to a number 9 blade to speed up the cutting process. I'll switch to a smaller blade when I cut the porpoises from 1/2-inch material and a number 12 blade when I cut the whales from 1.5-inch poplar. The remaining animals are cut from 3/4 material, and I'll use several wood species. This is where I can reach into my small leftover pieces pile. I don't like to call it a scrap pile. I reserve the term scrap for what's left at the end that's too small to use and has to be thrown away. Every week or two, I roll a bin full of these pieces to the curb for le jour de garbage. I usually use a glue stick to attach the animal patterns to the small pieces of wood. Using tape or spray adhesive is too awkward or messy for these patterns. This art doesn't have many animals, so cutting them won't take long. After they're all cut out, I'll give them a child-safe mineral oil finish. I already drilled the holes for the animals' eyes. If I remember correctly, they were all 1/8 holes. I cut the giraffe, camel, and elephant from red oak. I decided the bears look most like polar bears and cut them from maple. Maple is one of the hardest woods, so I needed to slow down a bit. The most important thing to remember while cutting the animals is to let the blade do the work. I know it's tempting to push harder to speed up cutting, because I find myself doing it, but pushing harder doesn't make the process go faster. When you put too much pressure on the blade, several undesirable results are possible. The first is that the blade may flex, and rather than getting a 90-degree cut, you may find the edge you just cut is curved. The second, and much worse outcome, is that the blade may overheat. You could get burn marks on the wood's edge if the blade overheats. An overheated blade can also snap. If you're breaking blades, it's a sign you're doing something wrong. Since I like wood varieties, I found a piece of sapele for the gorillas. I love the rich brown color of this wood. I cut the hippo from walnut, which seems to be an appropriate dark color for these massive beasts. I also used walnut for the horses. I could have used zebra wood and made these zebras instead of horses, but I didn't have any of that species available. I'm ready for some assembly, which will be completed in stages. You'll see why as I go through the process. A bottom deck and an upper deck will be glued to the sides of the ark. The two ends will touch the decks and be glued to the sides. I found through experience that trying to glue all these pieces together simultaneously is an unworkable nightmare, so we'll proceed cautiously. The first step is to glue 1/8 by 1/8 or 1/8 by 1/4 10-inch long strips to two places on the bottom deck and two on the top deck. The strips are on the top of the bottom deck and the bottom of the top deck. They're parallel to the sides of the deck and 3/16 in from the side. The sliding doors will ride in this groove, and they're 1/8 inch thick, so with these rails 3/16 in, that leaves 1/16 of an inch for the doors to move. That 3/16 measurement is essential for the doors to operate correctly, so I'm using a ruler to place these exactly. I was thinking about how vital this clearance was, and the line from the movie Airplane came to mind. "Give me a clearance, Clarence." That line in turn reminded me of another line from that movie where someone said, "I need a vector, Victor," or something to that effect. I squeezed a bead of glue onto one side of the runner and spread it out with my fingertip. Then I placed the strip down on top of the deck, checked the spacing once again, and clamped it in place. These small spring clamps are perfect for tasks like this. I placed one on each end and one in the middle. After that, I turned the bottom deck around and used the same techniques on the other side. The top deck is longer because of the ark's angled ends, but the runner that holds the door in place is the same 10-inch length. The runners for the lower deck are 1/8 by 1/8, and those for the upper deck are 1/8 by 1/4. Every time I use the term upper deck, I can't help but think about Wrigley Field. I'm not sure why the runners weren't the same dimensions, but I stuck with the design parameters in case the reason for the size difference was important. The first time I made one of these arcs, I was confused as to why the runner on the top deck didn't run the entire length, but the doors worked as they were supposed to, so I stopped wondering why and built the arc as designed. Because the runners only go part way along the length of the deck, I marked the center points of each piece and carefully aligned them during the glue-up. From then on, the procedure was the same as for the lower deck. I set both decks aside while the glue dried before proceeding to the next step. The glue is dry, so I'm ready for the next assembly stage. I'll start with the bottom deck because, as you'll see later, this will determine the top deck's placement. I've just eyeballed the lower deck's position in the past, but that's a terrible practice. This time I used the door's center as my reference point, found the center of the deck, and lined up the two marks. Because the ark's sides curve down at the bottom, the lower deck attaches to the arc side a fraction of an inch above the side's bottom. If I aligned the deck with the side's bottom, the deck's ends would extend past the side's ends. That would not only look awkward, but it would also leave a somewhat sharp deck edge exposed. Thinking things through before applying glue and clamps is always a good idea. Once the glue starts to set, you're committed, or else you have a mess to correct. I was pleased with the alignment, so I picked up my glue bottle, squeezed a bead of glue along the deck's edge, used a fingertip to spread the glue evenly, and then placed the deck onto the ark's side. I grabbed a clamp, attached it to one end of the deck, and tightened it down part way. Rather than moving the assembly around to get the clamps end under the ark's side, I left the assembly in place at the end of the workbench. Then, instead of juggling the long clamp, the deck, and the ark's side, which I've done in the past and it's not fun, I attached one of the clamp sides underneath the workbench. This gave me a stable surface to hold it in place while I tightened the screw and the clamp's end touching the deck. I'm unsure if this is an orthodox clamping method, but I've used it multiple times and it works well. Because the clamp is anchored to the workbench, this method allows me to use plenty of clamping pressure. I use the same technique on the other side of the deck. I removed the clamps holding the lower deck against the side, and now I can add the top deck. I found through experience that doing this assembly in stages works much better than trying to do as much as possible at a time. I'm using one set of doors as spacers to show me where to glue on the top deck. I placed one door at each end of the runners and slid it back and forth a few times from the end to the middle to prove the spacing was correct. After that, I squeezed a bead of glue onto the side of the deck and put it into place. I used the same method to clamp this as I did with the lower deck. When the clamps were tightened, I checked the doors for smooth sliding again. As the last step before leaving the glue to dry on this assembly, I placed the second set of doors into the space where they would be on the other side. This was a check that the deck was square to the side, not on a slight angle. If the deck were at an angle to the side other than 90 degrees, the distance between the two decks on this side would have been too large or too small. It was a Goldilocks connection, just right. The glue on the top deck is dry and I'm ready to move on to final assembly. Before I attach the end and the second side, I'll give you a look, sort of an x-ray peek at the arc. If that hasn't been easy to envision, you can now easily see how the sliding doors work. The two ends of the arc are the same shape, but one is longer than the other, so it's essential to install them correctly. I spread some glue on the side of one end in the usual manner, then placed it on the arc side that was resting on the workbench. I set the end so it would touch both decks and ensured the end's bottom edge was even with the arc side just above the bottom. Because the end is on an angle, you must orient it carefully. Because the two decks are already glued to the side, two solid surfaces are in place, and they provide clues as to where to mount the arc's ends. If you tried to attach both decks and ends simultaneously, and I think I tried it once, you would find it almost impossible. Once I had the first clamp in place, I added the second. This step was easier because the end could no longer move as I endeavored to secure it. I added the second end the same way as the first and left everything in place for an hour or so. The glue didn't need to be cured entirely, but I didn't want the parts wobbling when I installed the second side. I removed the clamps and spread glue onto the edges of the ends and decks wherever they would come in contact with the second side when I attached it. If your short-term memory is good, you'll recall that the windows on one side of the top deck are longer than the other, so I was careful to orient the side properly. I slid the doors back and forth a few times, one last check that they'd operate as they should. Then I grabbed a square from the counter behind me to check that the two sides aligned. It's not good to trust this step to eyeballing it without checking afterwards. Rather than partially raising the arc and risking the unsecured side moving, remember that glue's slippery at this stage, I slid it so that an edge was hanging off the side of the workbench. This made it easier to get the first clamp onto the other side that was resting on the workbench. Now I could lift the arc up to attach the second clamp to that end. I have one more part to add to the upper deck's top, not counting the two roof pieces, which I'll add later. This piece goes between the two sides and has a doorway through its middle. I added glue to the bottom and both sides of this part because these are the areas that will come in contact with the sides and top deck. Do you remember when I mentioned how it's vital to rip all parts to width simultaneously to ensure accuracy? If the two decks, the two ends, and this piece were not all cut concurrently, you risk a poor fit at this assembly stage. I know because it happened to me once. These pieces must all be the same width to align with the sides properly. Because this centerpiece in the arc's top is visible in the final product, I wanted there to be no doubt that it was tight against the top deck and the arc's sides. So I added two clamps to the sides and two long clamps to hold the wall to the top deck. Then I took the time to tighten every clamp while looking at every joint to ensure no gaps or other glue-up problems. The last things I added to the arc were 2/4 inch thick roof pieces, which I attached after I removed all the other clamps. I used tung oil to finish the arc, and after that dried, I added the shutters and planters, which I painted with acrylics. Noah and his wife are made from poplar, and I used acrylic paints on their hair, beard, and clothing. The trees are also painted with acrylics. The aquatic animals are all made from poplar, and I finished them with gray spray paint and used light blue spray paint for the water. The animals are made from various hardwoods, all finished with mineral oil. This was a large project that took a few hours to make. It was fun, and the arc and animals look impressive on a long display table in my store. It certainly catches customers' attention. I'd love to read your comments on this project, and I'll respond to every one. This video was longer than most, but I needed to cover many tips and techniques to be thorough. A like helps me grow the channel because it tells YouTube to recommend the video to others. Until next time, suggestions for what to watch next are on the screen now, and there are many more choices for toys and home decor items in the playlists, so keep on watching.